Welcome to Cold Steel, the Canadian Journal of Surgery podcast, with your hosts Amir Farouk and Chad Ball. The goal of the CJS podcast is threefold. The first is to highlight the best research currently being completed by Canadian surgeons. The second is to offer educational topics for both surgeons and trainees alike. And most importantly, the third goal is to inspire discussion, thoughts, creativity, and career development in all Canadian surgeons. We hope you enjoy it.
Surgical training is a series of tremendous transitions, starting from the transition from medical school to residency, from junior to senior resident, and then the equally big step of going from residency to fellowship. In this episode, we were lucky enough to be joined by two fantastic Calgary Surgical Fellows. Dr. Greg Knapp is the Calgary Surgical Oncology Fellow, and Dr. Salila Hashmi is the Calgary Hepato-Biliary Fellow. We talked to them today about how to get the most out of your fellowship, making that mental mind shift from being a resident to being a fellow, as well as the complexities of applying to a fellowship, which reference letters to use, and even get into the details of applying to a U.S. fellowship if you're a Canadian applicant. Check out the links below for more tips and tricks.
Can you start us off by just telling us a little bit about where you guys both grew up and what your training pathway has been, just so our listeners can learn a bit about both of you?
Okay. Amir, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Ball, for having us here. So I'm originally from Pakistan. I lived in Karachi, which is the largest city of Pakistan, for first 24 years of my life. Went to medical school there. And then as soon as I graduated, I came to the U.S., spent 2.5 years in the immunology lab at Emory in Atlanta, Georgia. Worked under my great mentors, Dr. Alan Kirk, Dr. Chris Larson, and Thomas Pearson. And after that, I did my surgery residency and critical care fellowship at Emory. And now I am here in Calgary pursuing a hepatobiliary surgery fellowship.
And Greg, how about yourself? Where did you grow up, and what has your training pathway been?
I'll echo Salila's thoughts. Thanks for having me. My pathway is not nearly as exciting or as global as Salila's. I grew up in southern Ontario on the south side of the lake in a town called Grimsby, which no one from Toronto knows where that is, but it's about a 45-minute drive. And went to undergrad at McMaster, and then did actually applied to medical school and graduate school at the same time. And probably as a shock to most people, including myself, I got into both and was able to defer medical school to go to London to do a 1-year master's in international health policy at the London School of Economics. I then came back, did medical school at Mac, and then went out to Halifax to do my general surgery training. 5 years there, and then I actually had a year in the community as a general surgeon in the small town of Woodstock, New Brunswick, as kind of a gap year between residency and then my fellowship training in New York at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and then here in Calgary in surgical oncology.
Greg, what prompted you to pursue a fellowship in surgical oncology? And I'm curious, especially given your tract, how early did you make that decision along your pathway?
So I was definitely a late bloomer. I've thought about this a lot over the years, and I think one of the factors was I think I did at least initially struggle to kind of find a real mentor that just really clicked with me kind of early in my training. And then kind of on top of that, I just had a real broad interest. Like I just seemed to love everything. Like general surgery was definitely the right fit, but slotting into where did I want to live? What kind of practice did I want to have? What was going to be my niche was tough. And so I actually bounced around. I did a 2-month elective in Cape Town at Tigerberg in trauma. I then ended up doing senior electives in pediatric surgery. And it was only after I came back from my pediatric surgery electives onto surgical oncology that I had that kind of like, oh yeah, like this is the right fit. I don't think I realized how much I didn't like pediatric surgery until I came back to surgical oncology. So I honestly didn't really know until I was like probably halfway through my fourth year, almost into my fifth year. And so that really, that definitely created some challenges in terms of getting into my surgical oncology fellowship ultimately, because I didn't have that kind of lead time. But that was my kind of my journey into it. What brought me, why surgical oncology? I think what really got me going was just I liked the complexity of the kind of multidisciplinary decision making. I liked the fact that like you had to be like I admired the surgical oncologists that because they really had to be on top of kind of a rapidly advancing front of knowledge. And on top of that, the ones I worked with in Halifax were really amongst the most kind of technically comfortable in the abdomen in a wide range of scenarios. And so I found that appealing.
So for me, it was switching of gears a little bit too. When I started residency, I thought I wanted to do a transplant, and the 2.5 years that I spent in the lab had sort of set the stage for that. But it wasn't until my third year of residency that I decided I wanted to pursue hepatobiliary surgery. And I think my mentor, Dr. Juan Sarmiento, had a huge role to play in this, both for my interest and my perseverance to pursue this. The complexity of the patients, the disease processes that we see, the operative finesse that's required for hepatobiliary surgery, and the ability to take care of both the benign and malignant disease processes is what really drew me to this field. And that's how I ended up here.
The whole idea of this episode is really to try to explore a wide range of issues around pursuing a fellowship. Everything from how to get into a fellowship, how to apply to one, what drew you to one. And I think one of the interesting things about fellowships is sometimes about timing. I think, Greg, you sort of had an interesting path for starting fellowship in that you spent some time as a community surgeon prior to coming back and pursuing a fellowship. What made you want to come back and do a fellowship, and what was that transition like? And how do you think that year that you spent as a community surgeon changed your perspective and experience during your subsequent fellowships?
So to address the first question, what made me kind of come back? I think it's important to kind of just state that like I ended up applying because of that lag time for my fellowship in my fifth year. So I knew at least by like a year 5, I want to do surgical oncology. We got to make this happen. And applied then, and then, knew I had a spot by the, kind of say June of my fifth year. So I knew I had this gap here. So I didn't go into community being like, I want to be a community general surgeon and then switch out. And I think that the people, and because I've got a bit of taste of both, I think that would be difficult. I think it would be difficult if you were like, I'm a community general surgeon for several years. It's certainly not impossible. And I've met some interesting people along the way who have done that, including one of my mentors in Halifax. So totally possible. But I think it's quite difficult because you kind of get out of the kind of academic flow. But, so I think that's kind of, point number one. I think point number 2 was I thought that year in the community was brilliant. I loved it. I thought like you work like a dog for 5 years. The fifth year is a total grind. And then all of a sudden you kind of finish. And then I had these like 12 months to A, decompress a little bit, but B, I was working in a rural hospital in kind of northern New Brunswick. There was just 2 surgeons. I was applying my kind of general surgery skill set and knowledge base that I had just spent 12 years cramming the nuances, I got to apply that kind of right away. And so for me, I thought it was a great year. It was almost like, in some countries where they have that kind of forced year of like military service, it was like, I probably wouldn't have chosen to do that had I, crafted my ideal plan. But I thought it was a great year to just get out there, pick up some skills, apply the knowledge, make some mistakes, learn how to run an office, how to deal with, interesting personalities in a small community. And so I took a huge amount out of it. In terms of the transition, boy, like what a culture shock, like going from rural New Brunswick to Memorial Sloan Kettering, that was an interesting transition. From kind of flannel shirts to like silk ties. It was neat. And it was, obviously it was a transition, but it was one that, at the end of the day, I was still coming into it with like a pretty confident skill set. And so I think that although I didn't have maybe the pedigree of some of my colleagues, I certainly felt comfortable with what I had to offer. And I knew why I was there, to pick up that kind of nuanced, oncology training and management. So the transition actually wasn't that bad, and it was actually a real thrill. And looking back on it now, it's a really neat juxtaposition between two systems.
As you've mentioned a couple of times, you trained in the U.S. for a period of time, and now you're training in Canada. We're curious, and you don't have to hold back, I promise, despite most of the listeners being Canadian. What are some of the differences you notice? It can be at the fellowship level, but certainly at the resident level between the U.S. and Canada, in terms of training in general.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So one of the first things that I noticed, both for the residents and the fellows for, being here in Canada, was autonomy. I think both in terms of operative autonomy and clinical autonomy. I feel like the residents and fellows get way more than I had experienced and seen in the U.S., which certainly reminds me of my time that I spent at Grady, which is a county hospital that, us as residents at Emory spend probably, if not half, majority of our time doing trauma and especially general surgery there. In the academic centers, it's a little difficult for both the clinical and operative autonomy, because you have, constraints like turnover times for the operating room. So it's going to be hard for the attendings to give you, from skin to skin sort of time to do those cases, because, they'll probably let you, or you'll decide on a part of the procedure that you really want to do, and they'll let you take lead on it. Or they'll let you start the case with a resident, but it'll be, difficult for them to let you go ahead and, take 3 or 4 hours at a case just because they're constrained in the time that they can give you. And the second thing I would say is that the attendings are a little bit more approachable. I'm pretty sure some of the U.S. attendings may not agree with me on this, but I feel like the relationship between residents and fellows, for lack of a better word, I would say it's more on a friendlier terms than, in the U.S. Like, I would be scared to talk about some general things in the U.S., which here I can just bring it up, which could also be because now I'm a fellow. I'm particularly more comfortable talking to attendings than I was when I was a resident, for sure.
Yeah, that's interesting, Salila. Having a lot of us up here, as you know, do our fellowships in the U.S. and then often come back. Not always, but usually we do. And there's certainly there's something to what you just said. There's a very different relationship, and it's a neat relationship between the fellow and the faculty, I think. Because to some extent, I experienced the same thing when I went both to Atlanta and Indianapolis and elsewhere as well. That relationship is quite close, and it's quite neat, and it's something you get to carry with you for really the rest of your career. A lot of us that have good experiences certainly do. What about in terms of workload for the residents, outlook, patient care? individual responsibilities surrounding patients. Do you have any comments on differences with that regard?
Initially when I came, I thought, oh my God, the residents here are not working as hard as they were in the US, but certainly that has changed over time. I think we work equally hard here as well as back home. Some of the differences were that our medical records are electronic. So by the time I finish rounds here, all the notes are written, all the orders are done, which for an intern or a junior resident back home, that's like the first hour of the day after you finish your rounds. And you're not allowed to be in the operating room until you finish that work. So that takes a little bit away from the operative experience, but then it also teaches you, time management, that you have to finish your work in the first hour, you have to prioritize things, and then, especially if you have to make it to the operating room. So I think both have their advantages. One thing, and I can only obviously speak about the residency at Emory. I think residents here, certainly I love the fact that they have half day here where they have dedicated time. Gradually as the residents, when I started, we only had 1 hour, and that was just a lecture given by one of the attendings. And then, it's gradually moved to 2 hours, but certainly having a half day to yourself, I think it's great for educational purposes, because it is very hard to find time during a grueling schedule to, study and keep up with academic work as well.
The truth is, both places I did my fellowship in the U.S., obviously one was Emory like you, the other being Indiana University, as well as lots of the places I visited doing grand rounds and so on, and professorships. The reality is, like, an hour a week that's protected is sort of pretty typical. And I think, the residencies in Canada, you're right, they're much better structured in terms of a lot more significant protected educational time. So, that's something that we're very lucky to have in Canada.
I wanted to shift gears here a little bit, start really getting into this idea of making that transition from being a resident to being a fellow. And I'm trying to do this myself as I head towards my own fellowship in colorectal in Vancouver in July. Obviously surgery is a very graduated process, and training is a graduated process. And so how did let's maybe start with Salila. How did you approach making that transition mentally from being a resident to being a fellow? And what do you think some of the key differences are, just in terms of how you run your team, or how you think about your role? Just overall, how do you think it's different being a fellow versus being a resident?
Yeah. So as I'll say that as a fellow, you are the backbone of the team. Residents will come and go. So you are going to be there for the year or for 2 years. So you have to set the precedent for everybody else on the team. You want to be the team that every resident wants to come to and, be a part of. So that's on you, how you set the mood and the tone and everything. Like, you can't be confused about a plan and expect the team to follow the plan. Like, you have to have a clear thinking in your mind. If something's not clear and you have to run it by attendings, just be upfront about it. Listen, this is something I'm going to talk to the attendings, and I'm going to circle back and get back to you about a final plan. And whatever you have final plans, just go ahead and do those. The other thing is also, I'll say that, Dr. Delman, my program director, always told us that when you're preparing for cases, be prepared that if the attending cannot make to the operating room, you should be able to do the case. And, it certainly holds true for fellowship, and not only being able to do the case, but also taking residents through the case. So, you're not only that you're learning, new techniques, or, you're improving on your techniques, but you also have to take a junior resident or a senior resident even, through a case, and, give them feedback how they can do things better. So how you expose something so that they can do better for you overall. And then it's just very more personal. Like, every patient is your patient. Every complication is your complication. Every success story just feels a little bit more personal. This is your family, and you have to take care of it. So, yeah, I mean, but it's fun and it's rewarding, and it's great.
I think the points that Salila brought up are bang on, and I think when I was thinking about some of the material for this podcast, I think that the ownership component, and to use that word, I think that's really for me what kind of separates the resident fellow consultant like transition. And as we already kind of alluded to, like I kind of had this 12 months where it was just me, right, and there was nobody else. And I think that probably accelerated a little bit that idea that as a fellow, you definitely, I think you not only feel a greater responsibility, but it is placed on you, and I think that is a really key part of that transition through fellowship into a consultant post. Is both taking that on and then embracing that, because I think that is what differentiates ultimately kind of the trainee from the ultimate provider, right? And there's with that change in mindset, I think it subtly changes your approach to how you see patients in clinic. All of a sudden, you're not kind of missing things. You're okay, in order to get the patient from this is the diagnosis and the workup to the operating room, there's a whole bunch of other steps, right? All the logistics, all of the stuff that you're not really privy to in residency, where you're just focused on saying, okay, this is the problem, this is what we're going to do. And then all of a sudden in fellowship, and then and the beginning of your career, you realize that there's all these other things that you got to do to get the person safely to the operating room, to get them through the operation, and then out the other side. And a lot of those aren't in textbooks. They're not taught. They are center dependent. And in those, I think those all get kind of wrapped up with true ownership of that scenario and that patient encounter. And I think that's what kind of defines a big part of what's different about a resident versus a fellow, kind of just in broad strokes.
And one comment I'll make is also involve the team and ask them for feedback. They may not like your style of leadership, and you may have to change gears and do things a little differently. I hadn't worked with Canadian residents before, so I don't know what they're used to as a fellow. So I have to stop and ask them, is this working for you guys? Is this working for the team overall? Ask your attendings, are you doing a good job? So, and you'll be surprised that you will get some feedback that will certainly stop you from doing what you're doing and make you think and change some of the things and actually make you better. So be prepared for that too.
I think that's really, I'm going to use that advice very, very closely, hopefully here come July. So I wanted to talk a little bit now about some specifics about pursuing a fellowship. And maybe first, we've kind of touched on this a little bit with you guys about actually figuring out what kind of fellowship you both pursued. Maybe Greg, you can just talk maybe in broad strokes. You talked about what excited you about surgical oncology. What sort of things do you think residents should think about when trying to pursue a fellowship in a particular area, but also about where to pick a specific spot or a specific program to do fellowship? Because that's also, I think, a key aspect of doing a fellowship is really trying to figure out where to go and where you really fit in.
Definitely. For me, the year at MSK, prior to coming to Calgary, I think kind of captures an interesting, anecdote to share, because that fellowship was 12 months. It was a new fellowship in global oncology, and I was actually the first fellow in this new stream. where it's kind of 6 months of clinical, 6 months of research. And the only reason why I got there is because I ended up at the end of residency, really realizing that like I was going into surgical oncology, or that was my interest. And I was still cultivating all along kind of a research portfolio in, first global health and then, kind of global surgery. And then realizing that I was going to have to find some way of marrying that with surgical oncology. And I hadn't really found someone that had done that, was doing that. I didn't have a mentor kind of in that space. And so I literally just spent, several weeks kind of looking and reading and doing some research, and found Peter Kingham at MSK. And I just sent him a cold email. I just sent him an email out of the blue saying, listen, like this is my story. These are my interests. It looks like you guys are doing some research and have this program in your Global Cancer Disparities Initiative that totally jives with where I want to go. Can we just chat? And that's basically how, we had a conversation, and then one thing led to another. And he was like, we got something coming down the pipeline that may be a perfect fit for you. And so that's how I ended up in New York. And so I think it speaks to, you may not have someone that is going to tell, it may not be obvious, right? And where you're going to do fellowship, and someone may not come to you and say, Greg, you should go to Toronto for surgical oncology, or you should go to Calgary. Depending on your mentorship environment, you very much may need to, take it into your own hands, think outside the box, think broadly, and kind of look for opportunities that aren't necessarily advertised, because I think that people respond really well to, initiative and when you come to them with ideas, and particularly when you come with them ideas that are kind of coupled with kind of solutions or a plan, people are very responsive to that, and so. That's a little bit rambling and a little bit of an offshoot, but certainly my first fellowship at MSK was not a textbook, that was not an advertised, kind of textbook year. That kind of came about in a different way, but it was probably one of the most fundamental years of my training, and really will have a massive impact on my career trajectory, especially on the academic side. And of course, Calgary was very, very responsive to that. When I came back to Calgary and said, hey, there may be an opportunity for me, to do a year in New York. What do you guys think about that? Could we make that work? Dr. Mack and the Calgary group was super supportive. They're like, yeah, of course. Like we can make this work. Like we can find a way of allowing you to do both. While potentially keeping your spot here. And so there was a lot of wiggle room that you didn't really realize actually existed, if you came to people with a plan.
I think it's so key in this whole thing is, yes, you need to find a fellowship program that you want to go to, but I think the key in this is that you really also have to really understand what you want out of your fellowship and what your overall plan is, because I think people can help you move that plan forward, but if you don't have a plan, then it's hard, I think, for any group to really make that happen and to cultivate your interests. How about for you, Salila? How did you decide on coming to Calgary, and what were the specific things that you were looking for in a fellowship? And I know you did a fellowship prior to coming to Calgary as well.
Yeah. So, when I wanted to do hepatobiliary, and there are 3 essentially routes to do it. You can do transplant surgery and go to a program which has a high volume HPB service with transplant. You can do a surgical oncology fellowship and, potentially either do an extra year of HPB or make your surgical oncology fellowship such that you spend more time on HPB services, or you can just do a HPB fellowship. So, again, you have to know what you want at the end of the day. And despite coming from a program, Emory is very heavy on surge onc training. I knew that I wanted to keep my general surgery and, add a multitude of hepatobiliary surgery in addition to that. And so that's why I went, for the hepatobiliary surgery route through the Fellowship Council. It's interesting when I tell people that I'm training at Calgary and, knowing my global history, they're like, "Are you a Canadian?" And I'm like, "No, it's a great program. It's one of the, 14 programs that are in the match for the Fellowship Council." And so, the expertise that are available here, the case volume, the variety, and also the general feel that you get once you interview, like, this is going to be your family for a year or two. Are you going to be happy here? Can you work with these people? Do you see them as your future mentors? And like Dr. Ball mentioned, this is going to be lifelong relationships for you. So all that, plays a role in deciding where you want to go.
That's well said, Salila. Maybe we'll start with Greg for the sort of next two-part question. There's no question. It depends, of course, and you sort of alluded to it, who your mentors maybe have relationships with. But how do you get in the door, do you guys think, of a given fellowship or fellowships if you don't have any personal connections to it? Greg, you talked a little bit about your cold email, and I think that's great advice. A lot of us have experienced that, whether it's residency electives or fellowships for sure. I'm curious what your thoughts are. I don't know whether it's right or wrong, but I usually give the residents, when they come to me and ask that question, a twofold answer. I say you can open all the doors in the world based on, like we said, connections with maybe your mentors to that subspecialty field or given institutions, or you can simply make your CV and your application package on paper undeniable. So dropping a phone book of publications in front of, an applicant committee is hard to ignore. So I sort of think that there's two ways to do it, and you certainly see on the receiving side, on the faculty selection side, examples of both. Greg, what do you think of that concept?
As I was mentioning earlier, that certainly I've definitely taken and have executed the one route, which is which is that kind of with some research, kind of reaching out and trying to cultivate something like de novo, and I think just kind of really relying on putting yourself out there, and making it, really kind of presenting a case and then making it easy for someone to say yes. I think that there's a lot to say about that, and that can be successful. I totally agree, though, that I think that's probably not that's probably not a dependable route. And there's absolutely no doubt, as when I think I was a little bit naive until I went down to the US, and that first couple of weeks at MSK, and you realize what the other people in the room have accomplished in residency, what they're bringing from a research background, from a publication background, and then the skills that they've had to acquire in doing that. Like, the fact that they've pumped out 20 publications, those aren't just 20 publications to pad a CV. They've also had to work incredibly hard, and there's a huge amount of subtle learning and skills that they've acquired along the way to get something to publication. And I think that is what is recognized, and they are able to converse and move around in a research world much more easily than someone who doesn't have that same depth. And I think that's that certainly goes a very long way. And there's no doubt that if you're kind of coming from a Canadian program, if you are interested in fellowship opportunities that are either going to be part of a North American wide match, or you are competing against American applicants, or want to go down to the U.S., that that is going to have to be a part of your game, and that is going to have to be a part of your process in order for you to be successful. So I totally agree. I think there are kind of multiple approaches. I think combining, I think in a perfect world, I would, you would combine kind of my initial cold email, cold call, looking for opportunities, creating opportunities, along with a undeniable CV, right? And one that really backs up your interest and speaks for itself.
Yeah, I think your comments are dead on about research in particular, and not because you may have a career that's heavy in research going forward, but you're exactly right. It shows the faculty selectors or selection committee that you can take a project, or ideally multiple projects, from start to finish, meaning you're a finisher. And you have insight into more than just the technique of a laparoscopic cholecystectomy or a given procedure. You have that greater, sort of wider view. And that's clearly very, very powerful. And I'll tell you that, again, on this side of the equation, it is a really strong predictor for a successful fellow. It's not the only predictor, and it's not always right, but in general, it's quite a reliable measure. So you're exactly right. And I do worry, it's particularly in Canada, less so in the US, that our residencies, as they drift away from completing research projects and it becomes less of a core tenet, that's going to hurt some of the applications, particularly to the US.
As an applicant, standing out, I completely agree with Dr. Ball. There are two ways to do this. Again, if you have made up your mind early in your residency about, wanting to do something particular, then plan for it. If you're going to go to a competitive fellowship, surgical oncology, peds, even hepatobiliary now, plan. Like, you could potentially take a year or two in the middle to do some more research, to build up your CV. I was reading an article, preparing for this talk a little bit and looking at the surgical oncology match. And it seems like that the programs want at least one first author publication published in a reputable journal, and at least 5 publications that you're a part of. And I think with time, it's just going to get even harder to get into these competitive fellowships, because everybody now wants to specialize. Especially in the US, like, out of the 10 surgery residents that we had, I think only 1 went into the community, and the rest all are doing specialty fellowships. And so how are you going to decide between one person and the other, especially to get through the door? Like, there are going to be cutoffs for every program, be it the number of publications, be it your scores. We have the app site in the US, and I'm sure there's something similar here in Canada. So, plan ahead, put in the hard work, talk to your mentors. If you don't have a specific mentor in your program, talk to your mentors. They may know somebody. Like, if you, like, we didn't do peds surgery as an intern and then as a 4th year. So if you want to do that, talk to your current general surgery mentors. They may have friends from med school, or, somebody else who they can hook you up to be as mentors. And you'll be surprised, like, how small this world is. And there will be people who will help you out to get to what you want to do.
So I think we've all highlighted how important your CV is and all this. Where do you think electives fit into this equation, Salila? How important are electives in securing a fellowship? And then when you're on your electives, what do you think are some key important things to do to stand out while you're on elective?
Yeah, so I think electives, I think of them as a double-edged sword, honestly. While you have a chance to go and show them how good you are, there's also a chance they're not going to like you. They may potentially give you, an invite saying that, okay, fine, they were here for, an elective, but they may not like you. So, 30 minutes is different from spending 4 weeks with them. So, be careful about deciding to do electives, certainly for fellowships. I think the letters, the scores, the work you've put in, speak volumes as well. So, if you're really struggling deciding between places, maybe doing an elective may be helpful, but I didn't do an elective for HPB, but I did spend my 6 months in my final year on the HPB service. Like, I wanted to be ready when I start as a HPB fellow. So I think it's something very personal. It also depends. I don't know if the Canadian residents do more, electives, but certainly the U.S. residents, it varies from program to program. As for doing, but I'll go back to my, like I said, I did 3 months of electives in, medical school, and that's how I decided I really want to come to U.S. to train here. So it certainly set a pathway for me. So again, you just have to be careful. As about doing well in electives, I think it just really boils down to small things like be on time, be there available for anything and everything on the service. Think of yourself as part of the team. You want to be enthusiastic, but then there's a line that sometimes you cross and you're like essentially on the nerves for, and I think we've all had students like that, certainly, in our services, or some even residents where, they're overzealous, they want to do a lot, but then they don't know when to keep quiet, or, when's the appropriate time to ask questions. They're not judging you on how good your skills are, because that can be taught, but they're really looking as a person, like, are you somebody that they can work for, like I said, for a year or two? Are you somebody who they can stand for in the operating room, like, for 6-8 hours if you have a long case? Are they willing to do that? Are they going to trust you with their patients? So those are the key things. So I think it really boils down to how you are and how you present yourself as a person, more than, what skill set you take. Yeah.
I realize, you two both are probably unique in terms of your fellowship path, and perhaps, electives actually maybe didn't play as much of a role for either of you in your fellowships. Greg, what are your thoughts on electives, and did you do any electives in surgical oncology prior to your application, and how important do you think those are in retrospect?
So I did not do any surgical oncology electives. As I said, I was late to the game. I did trauma, pediatric surgery electives, had used up what elective time I had before I realized that surgical oncology was for me. So I think that highlights that electives are not essential to get a fellowship spot, right? Like, I don't think I could be faulted for not doing electives. I just did not realize that was going to be my kind of ultimate kind of calling or pathway. And so I think it highlights that you don't necessarily need to have electives. Are they helpful? I think certainly it definitely taps you into the community. So if you spend some time across the country, you meet the players, you meet the people who are kind of leading the field, whether it's in Canada or the US. You meet the other kind of the other applicants, and so I think it definitely gives you a much broader kind of understanding. It kind of certainly broadens your scope in terms of practice patterns, so there's a lot of benefit, and then you're also a familiar face. There are other ways of doing that, though, and you don't need to do an elective to be a familiar face, to have your name out there, whether it's through research, through committees. There are lots of ways that I think you can mirror some of those benefits. So I guess in the end, I don't think it's essential. I think it's certainly helpful for the applicant that kind of realizes that that's an important part, or is a pathway early on. But for those who are late, you don't need to beat yourself up. There's nothing you can do about it. And there are other ways that you can generate the same opportunities that electives do.
One more comment I'll make for electives is, a lot of times, at least for students, I've seen that for medical students, when you're going to an institution, make sure you make arrangements, early on to make appointments to meet with the leadership there. So as a student, if you're going on electives, make sure you're meeting the program director. If you can, go ahead and make an appointment with the probably chief of surgery as well. I would say if a resident, you're going there, make sure if, you're not directly working with the fellowship director, do the same. Have exit interviews. It just really shows how interested you are. And certainly that feedback is going to help you later when you visit them for an second interview or, even for other interviews overall for fellowships.
That's a good point, Salila. And I would echo what you said, Greg, and then maybe add to it. Sometimes the electives we do as residents are just like your description of what we do as medical students. It can be more for us than even the reverse. And my personal story is very much like that. I figured out quite early I wanted to do trauma as part of my job within residency, and I went down for 10 weeks to a very well-known U.S. Trauma program where some of my mentors had trained previously, and I realized quite quickly that probably it wasn't as good as I maybe wanted, or maybe I should say it wasn't the right fit for me. I wanted a higher volume experience, and to be honest, if I hadn't done that, I probably would have ended up there. I suspect, just based on where it was and the sort of lore that surrounded it. But certainly where I ended up at the end of the day, again, was a place I hadn't done an elective, which was Emory. And that was for sure an incredible, I would say probably the best experience in the US. So, it's a little bit of us interviewing them too as the applicant, there's no doubt. I wanted to ask you guys specifically about asking or trying to figure out who should write your reference letters. And I'll just say again from the other side of the equation that the reality is, 95 or 99% of the letters are all great. Like they all say this candidate is superb. I support them 100%. They're going to make a great surgical oncologist or breast surgeon or whatever that is. So on our side of the equation, they can be quite difficult to decipher. There is certain code words for sure that some people will use, but in general, they're all quite good. Do you guys have any advice about who to ask and how to ask?
Like Dr. Ball said, all letters are going to be great. So, you have to make sure that your letters are exemplary, or at least one of them stands out as being the best. A couple of things, if you're applying for a certain field, like, I'll take example of Hepato-Biliary, and I don't have a single letter from a Hepato-Biliary surgeon, that's a red flag. Why is the department not supporting me, in doing what I want to do? But that being said, doesn't mean all 3 or 4, depending on how many letters you're using, have to be from all from Hepato-Biliary surgeons. A general surgery mentor or my program director may know me better than one of the other surgeons who I haven't worked with or don't have that much of a personal relationship. And I think you just have to be upfront about it. I don't think, there are going to be very few attendings who are going to refuse to write letters, but you can be upfront about it and tell them, is this going to be a strong letter? And, I think you can get a general sense that is this really going to be one of your strongest letters that you should use versus is this just going to be general run of the mill, a good applicant, which like Dr. Ball said, a lot of other people will have. So, a few things to keep in mind.
And just to add to that, I think for sure, you need to have if all the letters are good, then common sense would dictate that make sure, like, if you don't have the foresight to ensure that your letters are also good, right? Then that will immediately disqualify you from the process, right? So, the letters are about, in many ways, identifying red flags. So make sure you don't have any red flags. 2, you 100%, have to have the backing of your local subspecialty, and I think that, as Salila said, like, that's a must, because otherwise that is a subtle red flag. And I think we hear stories anecdotally of that happening, and that's not an uncommon theme that I've come across in the past. And I guess the third thing is, It does appear to me that it's a super small community, and it definitely helps. I think that I think it's probably actually quite important to realize, and I don't like to use this word, but like, what is the pedigree of, what is the family tree of your mentor, your institution? Where do they have connections? Who were their mentors? Because even though it's a small community, there is definitely a pull. There's going to be a familiarity. There's going to be a relationship that your mentors have with where they trained, and that, those letters, if it's also someone who you've worked closely with and have a really good relationship with, those letters are going to mean something maybe a little bit more, I think. And so I think that's important to keep in mind, because letters that are tied to a history, both kind of academically and personally, I think probably kind of help them float to the top a little bit easier.
I think that's, in my own experience, has been important, and you really do realize what a small world it is, and how much that personal touch in a reference letter really matters when it's two people who train at the same place or who knew each other from residency, how much that makes a difference. I wanted to ask you both about the dreaded personal letter, and I certainly struggled writing my personal letters for fellowship, because it's you sometimes feel like you have to write this award-winning Pulitzer Prize essay, and I'm not sure that that's actually right, or that programs really feel the same way about you writing a novel or an essay for your personal letter. Salila, what do you have any thoughts about how to write a good personal letter?
Yeah. So I'll say, like you said, you wanted to be shining and you wanted to be a great essay, but honestly, like, I think just make it simple, interesting, honestly. It doesn't have to be long. It should just tell a story about you and why you are here, where you are, and what you want to do. I was reading this article in, I think, Journal of Surgical Oncology, where they said that the personal letter is, the least likely of the things to matter in the, when they're coming to decide and choosing a candidate. But certainly if there's a close competition, like, especially for residency, if there are 4 or 5 people, or for fellowship, there are like 2 people they're trying to decide, that may really make or break the game for you. So, don't underestimate the importance of it. But like I said, it doesn't have to be fancy with like big words. Just make it simple. And like I said, make it personable and interesting. It also serves as a platform sometimes for your interviews. So be ready to like answer questions that you've written in there. Like, don't write anything that you're sensitive about or are not comfortable discussing in your interview. And certainly don't lie about things, in this world today, everything is a click away. You mention something that you've done and you actually haven't, people are going to find out about it. So, just be authentic.
Having, again, I think I have a limited experience with this, but certainly I've read letters in the past. I've written many myself, and it seems like a key is to understand that, it's probably not the most important thing in your package, but again, it can identify red flags. And so, just keep it simple. Don't write anything crazy, and have someone else look at it. Have someone else outside of medicine perhaps have a look at it, because you're just looking for kind of a genuine kind of letter of intent. And it seems like the people that kind of go on tangents or weave these complex stories, you either get lost or it gives you a weird vibe. You're just trying to state your intent, and then get you in the front door to let the interview or your letters or your CV do the talking.
I think my sense and my approach to it was talk about why you wanted to do your particular specialty, and then highlight a few things that make you stand out. But I think that's so critical that you actually get someone to read it and to keep it simple. You guys are both now approaching sort of the tail ends of your fellowship. And I'm curious how you structured your time as fellows, as a fellow, Greg. Particularly, I know there's a huge breadth of knowledge to actually get through, in addition to actually improving your technical skills in the operating room. How did you structure your time in terms of reading, clinical activities? And do you have any advice for people who are about to start their fellowships as to get the most out of it?
I think in an ideal world, you would know where you're going to end up after your fellowship. And so I think that how you structure your fellowship is to a certain degree, I think, and it should be, I think it's designed to be kind of tailored to the additional skills that you want to acquire, both from a technical and from a decision-making point of view, that will allow you to excel, where you see yourself ending up. So in the environment, in the niche, or in the community, filling, a particular role. And so I think an early understanding that you'll be able to tailor, you'll be better able to tailor your training if you have an idea and if you're working towards a particular job. Now, that's easier said than done. That whole finding a job bit is just as nebulous and could be another podcast. But I think that's important. And if you have something in mind, thinking about that early, working towards that, because I think it will really help. It really help narrow your focus and allow you to really get the absolute most out of your fellowship. I guess on top of that, I would say that you have to know coming in what your weaknesses are. So regardless of where you think you might end up, if there's something that you've come out of residency with not a huge amount of exposure in, I think that's part of being kind of a reflective resident, a reflective surgeon. What are your weaknesses? And then addressing those head on, because this is kind of your last opportunity as a full-time trainee to just devote time to that, right? And it's precious opportunity. And then I think finally, when it comes to reading and teaching, like I personally find that if you can't teach it, you probably don't know it, right? And so I like the idea of trying to do as much teaching as possible, both from a selfish point of view, because if you find yourself kind of stumbling or kind of, fluffing over a certain topic, then all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, I don't really have that down cold, right? And so constant teaching on the ward, on the whiteboard, it helps me, it helps me reflect on what additional knowledge I need to pick up. And I think it also helps just keep it regular. Just like in residency, I think a slow, steady accumulation is always better than cramming. And for me, that's about either trying to have a regular schedule of some questions or some reading, or teaching, as I said. And I guess just one last point on that, where you have perhaps a little bit more flexibility as a fellow than you do a resident, I found a particularly useful strategy for me on certain rotations in my fellowship has been actually doing a better job of prepping for clinic. And that's kind of allowed me to then take that clinic visit kind of to the next level, especially if there's some kind of complex new patients. I find it's been really helpful to kind of have a look at that list and really kind of dig into that patient before the clinical encounter, where time allows.
I've certainly, in talking about the teaching, I've certainly benefited from your 6:30 a.m. Fully white-coated, tied up teaching sessions on the 10th floor of the Foothills Hospital. So I'll say that I've certainly benefited as a resident. Salila, what advice do you have about in terms of structuring your time as a fellow and focusing your learning during fellowship?
Yeah. I mean, one thing I would say is, this is not easy. There is a lot of behind the scenes work that needs to be done when you're a fellow, which you probably don't appreciate as a resident, which is, the sort of same thing that you don't appreciate as a medical student, for the residents. But I think the key thing is to be organized. Make sure you have a weekly or a monthly planner, like know what cases you're going to have for the next few weeks. Like, if you don't have much information about the recent literature in terms of management or, the disease process itself that you're not familiar with, give yourself some time to come up with that. Read about that, and don't underestimate, like, Greg said, don't underestimate the importance of clinic. This is the time where you're going to be deciding not only about the patients that you're going to be operating on, but, deciding when not to operate on patients. And I think sometimes as a resident, you don't appreciate that, but in a few months' time, you will be in those shoes where you have to make that decision. There's, you can maybe call your mentors, but, it's going to be hard and you're going to be in those tough shoes. And so the more you do that, the more patients you see, the better, you're going to get, and the more comfortable you're going to get, for sure. Yeah, I think that's what I would say. And like Greg said, obviously, if you can't teach something, you don't know it well, be honest about it. If I don't know the answer to something, and I think Greg was on service and we had, quite a few discussions, and, there were things that I didn't know the answer to, and we were like, okay, let's look it up. You look this up and I'll look this up. And, it certainly helps. And you'll be surprised how sometimes, question from a resident or even a medical student, or sometimes even nursing staff on the floor, can certainly just lead you down a track, where you really need to read up a lot on a certain topic, which you thought you knew well.
Just to drill down a little bit more about the reading side of this, did you guys both, Greg, maybe to start, did you pick a particular text and sort of make a regular reading schedule, or did you, as you say, read around certain cases or topics that you thought were important as you went through?
When I started fellowship, I was mostly just reading around the cases and the clinics, for sure. And I was using that as the kind of regular entry point into the literature. And then on top of that, as kind of mentioned, the kind of the fairly regular Wednesday morning, teaching rounds, that kind of kept me on a fairly predictable schedule. Certainly now, as we're kind of coming to a bit of a close. The last 6 months, we have an exam at the end. I certainly have made a schedule just to make sure that I am, identifying what I need to kind of, now there's a timeline, making sure I'm covering the material I need to, with the particular endpoint, that being an exam at the end as kind of a hard hurdle, or like a physical hurdle to jump. With regards to textbook or in surgical oncology, in a lot of the fields, right? Like, it's moving so quickly. By the time it's in a textbook, people say it's already outdated. I think that's not necessarily true. There is still a huge amount, and certainly all of my old mentors have said and have loved to remind you that, there is publications from before, 2010, or there are publications from before 2000. There obviously is a huge body of background literature that has got us to the point where we are, and is still super relevant. And I do find that textbooks, like in surgical oncology, we have a Morita. There's is the lead author on kind of a general complex surgical oncology textbook. And it was published in 2017, and it's still very useful because it brings you up to 2017, right? And it's synthesized, it's condensed. The reference list is fantastic, right? And then, you have to supplement that 100%, right? But it does provide a nice format, I think, for me, for my learning style. And it does provide a nice summary to kind of bring you up to speed in areas that you may be a little bit more deficient.
Yeah, I would say that I do have a textbook, which is, Bloomgard's, but that doesn't mean I pick it up every day, which I probably should, and even if I read one page a day. But, yeah, just have one textbook that you can refer to. And, one thing I would say that I have recently noticed is that my, husband, who's a surgery resident, was always on my back to actually join Twitter. And I always held back saying that, no, I don't want to. And, I've done this recently where I have actually joined Twitter and then, just following, because all these, surgery journals have their own pages, or like your mentors or the big names in the field, you'll be surprised all of them are on Twitter. And if you follow them, sometimes they will have really valuable advice, or they will highlight some of the journal articles that you may not have noticed that have come out recently. And so, this is something that I have recently started doing, and I think it's worth doing, maybe spending 5 minutes. Don't do it socially and, making social friends, but certainly for professional things, I think it's a good addition where sometimes because I cannot certainly go through like 10 different, surgery journals, but certainly having the right people to follow and them highlighting the appropriate journals or the articles has, I think, been a good recent find. And, look into it. You may be surprised.
I'm very biased because you guys probably both know that I love Twitter. I think it's the best thing ever, and I love reading it. I probably spend too much time on Twitter, but I would echo what you said, that Twitter is a very valuable resource. In closing, and thank you guys both again for giving your time. I think this is going to be very useful for anyone who's looking into doing a fellowship. Salila, maybe I could ask you if you had to go back and do anything differently. I know you're not completely done, but if you had to do anything differently during your fellowship, knowing what you know now, what would that have been and why?
Yeah, I mean, again, I would say one thing would be, and I think that's going to stay forever, like, reading more. I always thought that I could do a better job of that during residency, and I still feel I could have done a better job in fellowship. The other thing I would say is, start early. Like, I picked up some of the research projects a little bit late in the game. I'm sure I'll be able to still finish it, but, certainly for taking things onto, a little bit next level, like I started working on a randomized control trial with Dr. Ball just recently. And, just with all the situation going on right now, that's been on a hold. So, had I started working on that earlier in the fellowship, maybe, things may be a little bit different, and we would probably have some, early data. So, that's what I would say. The other thing I would say is, it's a difficult, like we had talked about the transition being a resident and a fellow. The work will get done. Don't try to do everything yourself. Learn to delegate. You need to make time for yourself, be it for reading, be it for, your wellness, be it for going home and, doing 10 minutes of workout. So just, make sure that you use your team well. I think, initially I had a hard time of letting go. I have to look into the charts again and check on numbers again, if not before leaving, at night, things will get done. There are people who are going to take care of those things. So, I think trusting a little bit more than I initially used to than now I do. I think if I did that earlier on, maybe would have given me a little bit more time to spend in doing other things than, just being in the hospital.
Yeah, I thought about this question before the podcast, before the recording, and I think the one thing that jumped out is, I think the one thing that kind of really jumped out to me was, one, you really have to be honest, be honest with yourself about what you need from the fellowship. And I think if I was to do one thing differently, through both, it's just being there's always room for better communication and better feedback. And if you're not, it's a short period of time. It's a brilliant opportunity, and it goes by quickly. It goes by in a flash, especially when you're busy and trying to juggle a couple different balls. So you really have to be honest with yourself, and there's always room for better communication about what you need, to maximize your fellowship opportunity, right? And so that's about communicating that with your preceptors, with the services that you're on. And I think that I've always found that when that is communicated, people are very receptive to that, right? By this point, you are a fellowship, you are a general surgeon. You have something to bring to the table, right? And when you come to people and say, you know what, I'm not getting this, and this is how I want to get more exposure, or this is what I want to do differently, and you come to them with a kind of a plan. Again, I guess that's a theme I keep coming back to. People are really receptive, and I certainly probably. I definitely could have done a better job at various points in my fellowship doing that, expressing that, to just, to milk out even more from the opportunity. That would be kind of my only last advice.
Just before we close, I forgot to ask you guys earlier, and particularly Greg, I think this would be a question for you. For Canadian residents looking to go to the U.S., do you have any suggestions regarding visas, USMLEs, all that kind of administrative stuff that does sometimes become important when trying to go down to the U.S.?
Yeah, for sure. Because I've come across this numerous times. There is a ton of misinformation, and I think number one, do your own research. There's a lot of anecdote, and you'll hear other residents and other people tell you, oh, you need to have the USMLE for every program. It's just not true, right? Like, it is very state dependent. It is hospital dependent. Are you at a private hospital, a public facility? Is it a private cancer center? Is it, you've really got to look at the individual program and then reach out. They all have huge departments of people that deal with bringing in, bringing in foreign talent, right? They all have human resource departments. They're a simple email away, and they will clarify exactly what you need, right? I even found some of the blogs, there's a lot of general information that is actually not that useful. And so you got to identify what are the programs you're interested in, and then actually go to their websites and then take it a step further. If you're really interested and talk to either, past fellows, sure, but just go straight to, their HR department and be like, hey, this is like, I'm Canadian. I will be like a Canadian fellow, right? Board certified. What do I need from you guys? Or what do I need to have the appropriate license at your facility? And everyone's going to be different. And so I think if there's one take home message is kind of like, believe no one, do your own research. And it seems like it's very state and institution specific.
Amir, I'll just make one more comment. I met a lot of U.S. applicants who will be hesitant to apply to Canadian programs, especially for fellowships, thinking that there is a lot of paperwork that goes into it. Honestly, yes, it did span over a few months, and the only thing that took me the longest was getting my background check from FBI from the U.S. The rest was as smooth as it can be. So, don't be hesitant for the U.S. applicants to apply to Canadian programs. I've thoroughly enjoyed my time here and, wouldn't change my decision if I had to go back. So, and certainly happy to answer anybody's questions if they have any.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. Like in New York, it was actually surprisingly easy. I did not need USMLE. The visa was relatively straightforward. It was actually a lot more difficult to get my 2-month elective in Cape Town than it was to go to New York. So,
Salila, Greg, thank you guys so much for coming on Cold Steel. Absolutely fantastic.
You've been listening to Cold Steel, the official podcast of the Canadian Journal of Surgery. If you've liked what you've been listening to, please leave us a review on iTunes. We'd love to hear your comments and feedback, so feel free to email us at podcast.cjs@gmail.com or connect with us on Twitter @CanJSurge. Thanks again.